right, so we are actually one more week after this week. So next week is the end of 1 Peter. We're going to finish 1 Peter. And 1 Peter, in this letter, Peter's writing to real churches, real people and real churches who are facing real persecution because of a very real living faith in their life. It wasn't like they made a profession of faith and then they just kind of didn't live that way. They lived in such a way that the people around them saw it and persecuted them because of their faith. And so throughout this letter, he's been writing about how to handle persecution, how to handle suffering. And in the beginning of chapter 5, he kind of like zooms in on the pastors. And the pastors were the first ones that were being arrested, the first ones that were being thrown in jail and persecuted. And so he zoomed in to write to those pastors about shepherding the flock, even in the midst of this persecution, even in the midst of, even when the temptation might be to walk away with your life, to shepherd the flock of God. He also encouraged the church to humbly submit in their local churches to the spiritual leaders. And now, as we kind of like near the end of this letter, Peter offers a word of warning. And that warning has to do with Satan's attacks. All right, now let's go to 1 Peter 5:8. Now, there's a lot more that can be said than what I'm going to say tonight, a lot more. But let's just take a look, and I'll make some comments on this passage. 1 Peter 5:8. Be of sober spirit. Be sober. Be vigilant. We might have memorized. Anyone memorize it that way? Be sober. Be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walketh about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, right? Just something like that. Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And so what we have here is two actually commands in the original language. There are two commands: be of sober, be sober, be on the alert. And they really function as one command, but structurally speaking, there's two commands. Be of sober spirit. That means to be self-controlled. That means to be in control of one's thought processes and thus not be in danger of irrational thinking. Right? So sober-minded, right? Rational thinking here. It's not the first time that Peter calls a church to be sober. He's done this several times already in this letter. We could see it actually here in 1 Peter 1:13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. So now here at the very end of the letter, there's a few times he's already thought about this and already mentioned this, and now he's kind of coming back to this at the very end. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And we looked at that passage in depth at the beginning of the study of 1 Peter. In 1 Peter 4, the end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. And so these Christians need to be sober-minded. They need to be self-controlled. They need to be watchful. They need to be ready to respond to various circumstances that will happen in life. It kind of reminds me, because I try not to talk a lot about sports from the pulpit, but I'm a sports fan. And it reminds me of the professional athlete, especially the NFL quarterback, right? And I don't even, sometimes I'll watch, they have the game, and the game goes like left to right or right to left. But for like the national championship game, they'll have a broadcast on ESPN2 or something like that, where the whole game is broadcast from behind the quarterback, right? Anyone ever see the game behind the quarterback? You ever watch a game like that? Anyone watch? You saw like it's kind of cool, right? It gets a little disorienting because the way the camera moves, but it's like playing Madden, like playing the Madden video game. And if you've ever played the Madden video game, you're trying to figure out what the defenses are, and okay, well look, if it's crowded here, I really don't want to run. I'm going to call an audible and I'm going to throw a pass or something like that. Well, these guys have the ability to like really study and they know the different plays that are available, and they can read the defenses, and they're prepared to make the right play. Like I think the Manning brothers, especially Peyton, was unbelievable at being able to read a defense and change the play call because he was so prepared for like they would study film. They would study film of this other team's defense and practice that other team's defense. And so when he'd get into the game and he'd see, like, say, that safety's in that spot, he'd like, no, I can manipulate the situation. You know, if I get this guy one-on-one, I'm going to throw a deep pass. And it's really so much preparation and so much study, such that when they see that defensive alignment, they're ready. They're prepared. We do something similar when it comes to like conflict in our lives. So we'll anticipate how a conversation might go. Who here likes conflict? Anybody? Like, none of us really like handling conflict. But you know, from time to time it has to happen, and we start thinking through how might this thing go, and kind of preparing for, you know, that conversation. Or maybe if you're like a student and you know there's like a test or something like that that's coming up, you study the materials, so you're prepared, you're ready. Isabella had her first Greek quiz last week. And so what I did was I looked at the quiz, and I had highlighted the important things in the book that I wanted her to learn. And I noticed some of those things that were on the quiz weren't in the book. So I went back and I highlighted some of those things that were on the quiz, and I said, I'm going to tell you right now, and you might think this is cheating, whatever. I don't care. I want her to learn. I want her to learn stuff. So I said, there's nothing on that quiz that's not highlighted in the book. So if you learn everything that's highlighted, you'll be ready for the quiz. And she did okay. She did all right. What'd you get, like a 96, 97, something like that? I don't know. What's that, 93? She got 93. That's not terrible. It could have been better. It's not terrible. You know, the godly Christian needs to be prepared. He needs to be ready for whatever comes at him. It's not that you can consider every possible thing that happens, right? Because sometimes you're going along life, you think you're ready, and then like, boom, something happens that like shakes your world. And it's almost impossible sometimes to prepare for those specific things. But your mind is focused on Christ such that when a bad thing happens, you're ready to respond in a way that honors God. That's kind of the idea here. You know, be of sober spirit, be of prepared mind, so to speak. Now we know that Satan wants, like Peter, wanted to sift Peter like wheat. He wants to sift us as well. He wants to destroy us. And so when he comes, we need to be ready. We need to be sober. It's rational thinking and control of one's thoughts. We need to be on the alert. Again, separate commands structurally in the original language, but they function the same way. To be sober, to be on the alert. There might be a slight different nuance between these two ideas, but it's basically the same thing. And it kind of reminds you of, when you see the term being on the alert, might remind you of, especially in the ancient world, a soldier, like on the lookout, who might stand on the top of the wall of the city and look for invading armies that are coming and warning the people to be ready. You can't slack off. You can't fall asleep on the job. Can anyone think of an Old Testament story? And when I say story, I'm talking about history. I'm not talking about kids' stories. I'm talking about something that happened. Of some people that really were supposed to be on the lookout, protecting someone, but instead they fell asleep. Can anyone think of, go ahead. Okay, well, yes, but I'm thinking of I appreciate the fervor in trying to answer. So we're thinking of an Old Testament example of someone who maybe fell asleep and almost cost the guy he was protecting his life. That's a big hint. He almost cost the guy he was protecting his life. And one boy raises his hand, mom puts his hand down, raises his other hand. I want my turn to say something. Nobody? Old Testament. He was, what's this? Yeah, I mean, really the whole army, but, Abner, and so Saul's military jet, what's that? Well, the piece of the robe was cut off in the cave, but the spear was taken when they were all sleeping, and yeah. So, I mean, they weren't ready. they weren't on the alert. And if David were a lesser man, they would have skewered him, right? So, and Satan certainly would have wanted to destroy, that's for sure. So unfortunately, the fact is that a lot of times Christians aren't ready. They're not sober-minded. They're not on the alert. And when Satan attacks, it hits them right between the eyes. And sometimes when those things happen, you really see where you stand with God. And that's where a lot of times people will backslide or fall away, or in some cases apostatize and just walk away from the faith altogether. And so the godly Christian needs to be sober. He needs to be ready for Satan's attacks. And then we have the reason why he needs to be ready. And we don't have like a verbal clue. A lot of times it would, be sober, be vigilant for your adversary, the devil, right? Is that how it reads in the King James? Be sober, be vigilant for your adversary. I don't remember if the word for is in there or not. But the idea certainly is. It's basically giving the reason why you need to be sober, why you need to be vigilant, why you need to be on the alert, why you need to be ready. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He is your adversary, first off. All right, so he is the accuser. This is the same as the Hebrew word for Satan. He is prowling around, and that kind of reminds me, I think I have this reference up. I hope I have this. Yeah. Here in Job 1:7, Satan is roaming around. The Lord said to Satan, "From where did you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around." What else would I be doing? Looking for people to devour, right? In other words. So here he's going to and fro on the earth, and he is a fierce, predatory lion, a roaring lion. Now, I've told you guys in the past that I used to watch a show, and it was on TV. It was a nature show. I really enjoyed this show. It was called Big Cats. Anyone here ever watched Big Cats before? Abby, you watch Big Cats? Troy, you watch Big Cats? I used to love Big Cats. The terrible part is I'd root for the lion. You know what I mean? My wife would root for the gazelle. The gazelle would be running, and he'd be running, and, "Oh, please get away." And I'd be like, get him. And then, the gazelle would turn. I'd be like, "No, he's going to miss his meal." Did you ever find yourself rooting for the lion or for the cheetah? You always rooted for the gazelle? Who'd you root for? You'd hope he gets it. You'd root for you. And Abby, you rooted for the gazelle. It was a spectator sport for me. I was spectating, so it's like everything is just. It was like watching, the hunter and the hunted. But you'd watch these predators, and they'd follow lions and cheetahs and leopards and so on. And you'd watch when the lion would get its eyes on a prey, and you'd just see I don't know, it just looked like pure evil, right? You just saw the fallen nature of the world. And it would pounce on its prey and grab its prey's neck, and then an entire, let's say, pack of lions, if it was a lion, would sit there and eat the animal as it groaned, as it was being eaten alive. And they ate it into non-existence. That's like a fitting picture of what Satan is. One thing I noticed when I watched the show is that the lions never went after the strongest in the pack. Every once in a while, you'd see, like the buffalo, right? And the lion would have its eyes on a buffalo, and then when the big buffalo would come out, and the lion didn't want anything to do with that. Didn't have his eyes on the large buffalo. He had his eyes on the most vulnerable, sometimes the younger ones, the easier ones to attack. And so they'd go after the one that trails behind the pack, or they'd go after the one that gets separated from the pack. That's what the lions did. And that's what Satan does. When he sees someone who's vulnerable, he pounces. He pounces. He wants to get you to a state of vulnerability, and then he wants to pounce, just like those lions did in that show. He wants to get you separated from the pack. He wants to single you out and destroy you. He wants to divide and conquer. That's what he wants to do. Satan walks about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. He wants to tear you into pieces. He wants to destroy you until there's nothing left. Here's another thing I noticed about big cats when I watched the show. Like lions, and sometimes like the cheetahs or whatever, they kind of roamed around openly at times. And sometimes, you ever notice, remember that in the show? They just kind of roam around, and the pack would see them and just kind of be on the alert. And when the pack was on the alert, the lion really didn't have a shot. If he was prowling and they noticed him, he might just give up because he knows, I'm not going to get him. And so what they would do is they would prowl and they would sneak up and they would stay hidden in the reeds until they got close enough, as close as they could. They would find the most vulnerable animal they could, and then they would attack it. And the animal would suffer. And the worst part about the show was, let's just say it was a small buffalo, and there were 4 or 5 or 6 lions just eating at its belly, and you just hear the buffalo like groaning in pain as it got eaten alive. That's Satan. That's the picture of Satan. Satan wants you to be unsuspecting. He wants to sneak up on you and attack you. He wants to bring you to spiritual ruin. He wants you to become, again, separated from the flock. And when he gets you separated, he pounces. He wants to destroy your faith. He sought to do that to Peter's readers by means of persecution. And that's what we've been reading throughout this letter. He accomplishes it in the church today, I would argue, by many means, one of which is the compromise and worldliness of the modern church. He gets believers to compromise and blend in with the world. He convinces them they don't really need the local church. You hear people say, I don't really need to go to church to be a Christian. Well, Satan's convinced them of that. That's a complete lie. Local churches have now grown so worldly that you can't tell the difference between a worship service and a secular rock concert that has a little bit of a motivational speech at the end of it. And Hillsong thrived on that type of thing. Hillsong thrived on manipulating its audiences with some experience that they offered to people. Just like my brother said many years ago, he'd just be like, hey, he'd meet someone on the street. Hey, you interested when he was single? You want to go to a rock concert? And they'd go be like, sure. And he'd take her to Hillsong. He'd take her to a quote unquote church service. But all it was he was right. He was right the first time. He was just taking her to a rock concert that had a motivational speech attached to it. And all the while, that guy who was given that motivational speech was sleeping with women and pretending to be something that he wasn't. Listen to what Paul Harvey wrote or said in 1960. You've probably heard this. I'm sure many of you have heard this. Now, this isn't the whole thing, but this is a good portion of it. 1965. Give me a second. I'm getting older. Sorry. I gotta read stuff. If I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square, or that was 1965, so boring, right? Anyone remember the word square? I never used the word square. Beav did, though. Beaver and Wally. I'd convince them what's bad is good and what's good is square. And to the old, I would teach to pray after me, our Father which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies. I'd peddle narcotics, drugs to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. And if you don't think secular psychology is doing that today, then you're not paying attention. So that's exactly what secular psychology is doing. Secular psychology is a tool of Satan today. I'm going to tell you that right now. And they also say that instead of dealing with sin, they call everything a sickness, instead of dealing with the real issue, which is a sin problem. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions. Just let those run wild. So before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. 1965. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion. Well, isn't that something? The sufficiency of Scripture is no more. Now, if you have a quote-unquote mental illness, it's, well, I'm not going to go to God to figure out how to resolve and what really is a sin issue. I'm going to go to some counselor, some secular counselor who's going to put me on some pill that's going to somehow resolve my spiritual problem. Paul Harvey said, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle or Satan Claus. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who want until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. That's liberalism and socialism. And what do you bet? I could get whole states to promote gambling as a way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work and patriotism and moral conduct. I would convince the young men that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, and that what you see on TV is the way you want to be. And thus, I could undress you in public, check, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. Sounds like the world today. In other words, Paul Harvey says, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing. Paul Harvey, good day. Something like that, right? Beware of the devil. He wants to destroy you. He wants to tear you, devour you. And that word devour is like eating flesh until there's nothing left. But all is not lost, for the believer has action that he can take. There is preventive action that we see in the beginning of verse 8. Be sober, be on the alert, be prepared. That's preemptive. That's what we're doing before Satan attacks. Because we know he's out there. We know he's roaming around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So there's preemptive action of being prepared, being ready. Then there's responsive action in verse 9. That is, I'm responding to the attacks of Satan. I'm prepared for the attacks of Satan. I'm responding to the attacks of Satan. Verse 9, but resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. So what we have here is this charge. This is the third command, which is really, it's the third structurally speaking in the original language, but really it's the second real command here in the passage, functionally speaking. Resist him. We can resist Satan. The word means this: to be in opposition to set oneself against, to oppose. And so we actively set ourselves against Satan in the battle. We are in spiritual warfare against Satan, and we set ourselves against him. And we do that by submitting to God. And we'll see that in a second. The weapons of our warfare are not physical. It's not a physical battle we're in, but a spiritual one. And the Apostle Paul writes about that in Ephesians 6 when he says, therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. And these weapons that we see in Ephesians 6:13 through 18 are truth, righteousness, a genuine walk with God. peace, faith, salvation, the word of God, and prayer. And I'm not going to go through that in any depth. You can go back and we have a message on that a few years back. You could summarize it by saying if you have a daily, genuine walk with the Lord, a legitimate walk with the Lord, that's how you stay ready and that's how you resist Satan's attacks. Satan's not going to go after the guy that's strong in faith. I mean, he might, but he's not going to be successful. He's not going to pounce on the large water buffalo in the pack. He's going to look for the tiniest little one that he could tear to shreds that won't give up a fight. And whether you, regardless of what you think about yourself, it's possible that you are that vulnerable water buffalo. James tells us, James 4:7, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And so part of our resistance to the devil is submission to God. There's basically the same way of saying it's basically what's the word I'm looking for? They're complement. What's that? I know what you're trying to say there. Complementary ways of saying the same thing, really. Part of our resistance to Satan includes submission to the Lord. Peter says, resist him firm in your faith. Faithfulness to God is a combatant against the wiles of Satan. Now, there used to be the philosophy that, let's keep the people busy. Let's keep people busy. Let's keep them in church. Let's have all these different church functions. All these, that Sunday night's going to be church, and Tuesday night's going to be calling, and Wednesday night's going to be prayer, and Friday night's going to be something else. And the philosophy was, let's keep people busy so they don't go out and sin. And I don't share that philosophy. I understand the thinking. I understand where it came from. I understand why they think that way. But I think there's such a thing as keeping people so busy that they're actually neglecting their private walk with God. If you are faithful to the Lord, if you're faithful to worship, if you're in fellowship with the people of God, if you're in discipleship, if you're in prayer, these are ways to stand firm, to resist him firm in our faith. And it's like what's written in Isaiah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. And a different people in a different context, but truth still applies. For Peter's readers, one of the main ways that Satan attacked was, again, through persecution. Resist him firm in your faith, knowing something. We're modifying, the main verb here is to resist, okay? And the modifying phrase, clause, whatever you want to call it here, is we know something. And the content of what we know is that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. That is, Satan's already attacking them. Satan was already attacking them through the persecution that they were facing, through having been forced to flee from their homes and from their towns, and all this different stuff that was going on, maybe imprisonment, whatever. In some cases, maybe death, especially in Rome. Although I tend to think this was written to Jewish Christians who were far from that stuff in some cases. But Satan was attacking through persecution. It was pretty much unavoidable in the first century. And these Christian brothers and sisters that Peter is writing to were experiencing a certain level of persecution, the same sufferings that other Christians were suffering in other places. Satan was causing suffering any way he could. And so Peter's readers needed to know something as they resisted. They needed to be preemptive. There was preemptive action in being ready. There was responsive action. And in responding to the attacks of Satan, they needed to understand that they were not alone. That there are other Christians that were being attacked by Satan that were experiencing the same suffering they were experiencing. There's just something comforting about knowing I'm not the only guy going through this. And so there's that preemptive that preemptive action of being prepared. There is that responsive action of resisting him when the attacks come. And then there is really kind of the basis for success. How I succeed when it comes to Satan's attacks. And it's not based on what my own personal strength, it's not based on me being some great thing or me being some awesome person or me having more strength than someone else. But the fact that I need to rely on God for strength in that battle. Look at verse 10. After you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And so you see that they suffered, right? That is, they went through tough times. And we've seen that throughout this letter. But you also see an important, comforting truth. And that is that their suffering is not permanent. It's temporary. A little while they suffered. It's limited in time and space. It's nothing compared to the eternal glory that they'll have in Christ. We think of this life, this little while portion is a portion that we really think about a lot and we focus on. And that's because, time in our experience, this isn't fact, this isn't how it is in reality, but we perceive time to be relative to a certain extent, right? Time feels like, relative sometimes. What I mean when I say that is there are days you're having a lot of fun, you're just like, man, this day was so fast. And then there are days where it's like an hour feels like, 2 days. Or, it's the end of the day and you feel like the stuff that happened earlier in the day was actually like 2 or 3 days ago because that's how long that day felt. And suffering only compounds a thing. Suffering can make hours feel like days, and days feel like weeks, and weeks feel like months, and months feel like decades, right? Suffering can really make time feel like it's going on forever because there's an experience, and our experience time feels relative. It feels bad when you're suffering. And so it's easy to focus on the little while of suffering. But that little while, as we've talked about many times, it's but a speck, just a speck in the timeline of eternity, a timeline that goes on beyond the length of your imaginations, right? A timeline that would go on and wrap around the world over and over and over and over and over again. And this life is just a tiny little blip on it. And all the compromises that you make in the here and now are compromises on that little blip, that little speck of that eternal timeline that will affect the rest of eternity because of the stuff that you're messing up, right? In that tiny little speck of time you care so much about. After you have suffered for a little while, just a temporary period, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. So we have a few things. We have suffering and glory being, can we use the word juxtaposed again? Right? Being kind of set apart from each other. And we have a little while and eternal being set apart from each other. Suffering here, now, for a little while, just that tiny little speck, nanoparticle of space on history's timeline, and glory for the rest of it, for eternity. He is the God of all grace, we see in verse 10, who extends favor to those who don't deserve it. He'll perfect the Christian, that is, he'll bring them to maturity, and he'll ultimately bring us to glory when creation is restored. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3:3. But the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen and protect you from the evil one. God here in 1 Peter 5:10, he will perfect He will confirm us. He will strengthen us. He will establish the Christian. There's these 4 verbs, right? He'll help the believer be firmly committed to him. Listen to what one writer says about this verse. All 4 verbs are intended to strengthen, empower, and secure Peter's readers in this present life as they continue to face their fiery trials for a little while longer, just a little bit longer. God is strengthening them. Although Christians may face unjust circumstances that are never put right in this life, those circumstances can be given up to God with the confidence that he will indeed make all things right in eternity. Many people have warned of Satan's attacks. Many people have been warned about Satan's attacks. Many people have been overcome by those attacks too. In verses 8 through 10, Peter warns his readers about how to handle Satan and his attacks. And then in verse 11, he offers praise to the Lord who helps us achieve the victory. Verse 11, to him be dominion forever and ever. Amen. In eternity, all of this persecution ends. In eternity, Rome has no authority. Caesar cannot persecute. Nero in eternity will not be cutting off people's heads and crucifying the saints. He'll be suffering in hell for all eternity, paying the penalty for his sins, a penalty that Christ offered, that Christ paid for. In eternity, Satan no longer has dominion. He no longer walks about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. In eternity, Satan cannot pounce. In eternity, God has all the power. He has the dominion throughout all of eternity, forever and ever. So as the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 1:17, now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. And so in this passage, 1 Peter 5, 8 through 11, it's clear that we need to be ready for Satan's attacks. We need to resist him through the power of God, being firm in the faith. We need to take preemptive action. That is, we need to be ready for his attacks. We need to take responsive action. That is, when he attacks, we need to resist him and submit to God. We need to realize and rely on the strength of God, the power of God throughout that process. The unfortunate truth is that too many Christians simply aren't ready. Too many Christians simply aren't on the lookout. Sometimes I think they don't even realize there is a battle. They don't realize they're in a battle. Little compromises sneak in. The priority of worship begins to take less of a priority. Worldliness creeps in little by little. Doesn't creep in all at once, just a little bit here, a little bit more, a little bit more. People begin to distance from the local church. They begin to read their Bibles, maybe just a little bit less. Pray just a little bit less. Fellowship just a little bit less. Remember we talked this morning about the circle of friends? Talked about Joseph of Arimathea's circle of friends. Maybe the circle of friends moves from the body of the local church to more and more and more people out in the world. And when that happens, when Satan begins to take a person and slowly drift them away from the pack, they now become that vulnerable water buffalo that can easily be pounced upon. And Satan will pounce, and he will tear your life apart. The godly Christian needs to be ready for Satan's attacks. Best way to be ready is to keep close to the Lord. Be in his word, study it, know it, live it. Be in prayer, surround yourself with God's people. Be around God's people all the time. Be committed to the local church. Stay connected to local church discipleship. I would say this, and this might sound a little self-serving, but let your spiritual leaders into your life. I'm going to tell you right now, most people don't want that. I don't want that because the fact of the matter is, if I let someone into my life they'll figure out too much about me. And when they figure out what I know about me, then they're not going to like what they see. Wasn't that kind of one of the reasons why the church exists, right? To be a support group for you, to help you, to help you grow closer to him, maybe to help you with some of the spiritual struggles that you have in your life. And if you are continually devoted to the apostles' doctrine, which we find in the writings of the New Testament, to fellowship of the local church, to discipleship, to the breaking of bread, to prayer, then you'll be ready for Satan's attacks. You'll be ready. You'll be prepared to handle it in a way that pleases the Lord. You'll know how to resist Satan. In that particular instance, you'll be strengthened by the Lord when Satan's attacks come. The godly Christian must be ready for Satan's attacks. We need to be preemptively ready. That is, we need to be prepared for his attacks. We need to respond when he attacks by resisting him and submitting to God, being firm in the faith and relying on the Lord's strength for help throughout the attack. Let's take our hymnals and turn to hymn 435. Hymn 435. We'll close our service with a hymn. If you're not sure you're saved, then you come and see me on the way out. If you're listening to this message and you're like, you know what? Yeah, man, Satan's been attacking and I've been letting him win. I've been that vulnerable lamb or sheep that Satan's come after. And I've put myself in that position, maybe even by separating myself from the flock or whatever. Then while we sing this hymn, great thing about God is he's ready, he's waiting to embrace you and to uphold you. And so you pray while we sing. Stand and sing 435.